to the People by People podcast with me, your host, Laura Sutherland. This is a very special episode today because today is International Women's Day. And I'm so pleased that one of my women in PR gals is joining me today. So welcome Shayoni Lynn, founder and director of Lynn PR, and she is making waves. Thanks so much for taking the time out your diary, Shayoni, to chat to us and to share some of your wisdom. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Laura, and what a special episode to be featured in as well. I'm really excited to be here and I'm looking forward to a discussion today.
Me too, definitely. Well, kind of, I suppose the sort of reason this works so well is that the theme of this year's International Women's Day is choose to challenge. It's a hashtag too, if anyone wants to search for that. And you know, they've kind of talked about, you know, a challenge world is an alert world, and from challenge comes change. So let's all choose to challenge. And I think that's really relevant to our discussion today, and people will definitely see the tie-in. But I think it's also a good way for us to be able to demonstrate how we support other people. So one of the ways that I like to support other women is by giving them a voice. So whether it's on the podcast or it's over on the blog, and just offering them just general encouragement and support. I just think it's so important that we support each other. So I think it's amazing that this special episode features you, and one of the focus is behaviour change.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, exciting. And I agree. I think as women and female leaders in this sector, that we do need to support each other and support future generations. So thank you for having me and talking about everything that I love, which is data and behavioral science.
Yeah, me too, definitely. We talk a lot about data and using that to inform strategy. And many people think it's like revolutionary and they think that we're speaking like a different language. But, you know, data is at our fingertips. It is there and it's there to be used. It's what we should all be doing. If you look at the impact that we need to deliver from the work that we do in building relationships, managing reputation and seeing change, human behaviour it's basically front and centre to that. It's key to everything, isn't it?
Absolutely. Data is definitely at our fingertips, and I don't understand. I don't understand, and I'm also frustrated when people say that they can't find the data, because the data is increasingly available to us, and I understand concerns around the data that is available to us, and it is our responsibility to use that data correctly and ethically and for the purposes of informing programs that help improve lives. Absolutely, human behavior is front and center of what we do as PR practitioners. We are here to persuade people. We are here to influence them to better their lives in some way or the other. And an understanding of human psychology and understanding of how people make decisions will only empower and enhance communications programs. I think through this pandemic, we have seen the importance of behavioral science and communications and what it can do to help create new behaviors and create new habits at pace. A year ago, if you told a behavioral scientist you'd get the Western world to be wearing masks, you know, we'd have a laugh at you. But it shows that human beings are capable of huge change at very quick pace. So as communicators, if we want to get our audiences to take up services that improve their lives, to access events that will help them improve their lives. You know, it's all about how we add value to our audience's lives. And we must understand how they make those decisions, how they view the content that we put out, how they react to that content, both, you know, on a conscious level and also on a subconscious level, and what would make them engage with us better, quicker, and in a way that is in support of their improvements.
And I think one of the things I've talked a wee bit about recently at events and on the podcast too has been that sort of knowing your audience, because one of the assumptions sometimes that maybe prospective clients make if you work in the agency world, or maybe if you're maybe a new team within an organization, a new PR team within an organization who's not familiar with the need to know the audience. We have to know real like inside and out, you know, of these people, about what makes them tick and what they like, what they don't like, where they hang out, and as you say, all the sort of the psychological stuff as well about what makes them do stuff. And that's something I think that is far too often missed. and it should, I think, be sort of ingrained in, you know, in briefs for campaigns, or even just actually, if you think about it generally, in business plans.
Yeah. I completely agree. I mean, we have to know our audience. I often used to use this as an example when I was in-house previous to running Lynn PR. You know, we work with specialists in everything that we do. We are working with academics or some sort of expert or the other. We are never the subject matter expert. Where we are the subject matter expert is our audiences. That's what people pay us for, is to really understand and be able to, in some ways, predict how people will react to certain content and certain creatives. And that's where knowing it's not enough to know who they are. It's important that we understand how they will reach a specific outcome that we're trying to drive them towards. It's important to understand the attitudes that they have, the habits that they have, the preferences they have. So we can ensure then that our communications can remain as relevant as possible. If you think about audiences, you know, as ourselves, you know, we are someone's audience, right? And we are bombarded with content comms every single minute of the day. When we're on Facebook, when we're online, whatever we're doing, when we're out walking, there's a billboard looking out at you. Everyone is vying for our attention. So why should I care? Why should I give a brand and organization my time, my attention? And then why should I do something that a brand or an organization is asking me to do? And understanding those motivations is key to being able to drive behavior.
Yeah, I mean, the question why is probably one of the most powerful questions that we will ask clients and organizations. And I think sometimes that it can be, especially if people don't necessarily understand the reason we're asking why, I think people can sometimes kind of be like, is that a question? Are you actually questioning me as to why I'm thinking of something? You know, are you questioning it, or do you genuinely need to know why? And I think it is one of the most powerful questions that we can ask, because only by asking why do we get to understand, essentially.
Absolutely right. You know, why are we doing this? What is the objective? What is the business objective? And then only once we understand what the organization or the business is trying to achieve, can we develop communications and campaigns that are optimized to deliver on those objectives. So unless we understand the purpose behind a specific piece of work, we won't be able to deliver strategic comms. We will be able to deliver comms. You know, there's no...
anyone can do that, Louise.
Anyone can do that, right? Anyone can put out a social media post or write an email. And even, you know, to some respect, specialist comms, you know, you can create a video, you can do X, Y, and Z, but will it work with your audience? Probably not, unless you figure out what you're trying to achieve, who you're trying to persuade in that journey, how that individual or individuals view your brand, your organization, your messages, your content, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why wouldn't they do something that they're asking you to do? What are the barriers? Why wouldn't they take up on a service or, you know, buy a product? Unless we answer those questions, we can't develop solutions that will work. We can develop really fancy, creative assets, and we do, but do they work? Do they lead to outcomes? And that's a question that we ask at Lynn PR all the time. What has this campaign done in tangible terms that has resulted in change?
Yeah, totally. So how do you think then, for people that maybe don't really know very much about this, how can people apply a behavioural approach to their programs if they haven't done it before?
I think as communicators, we are generally very instinctive, and we do apply a lot of behavioral science principles to our programs without realizing that we are doing it. Behavioral science, in a sense, is quite a, in some ways, it's a very emerging field, but in other ways, it can be traced back all the way to the 18th century. And Adam Smith and the concepts of overconfidence and loss aversion that are still relevant today. How you would apply it, I think it's understanding, it's a methodology, not so much a tactic. It's understanding what it is. It is an understanding of human behavior. So it's not enough to segment your audience, for example. It's important then to understand those specific segments and how they currently view a particular ask. So if you're asking your audience to do something, do they have the capability to do what you're asking them to do? Do they have an opportunity created by society or created even by, you know, physical opportunity? Do they have How are they going to do the things you're asking them to do, and what would get in the way? And once you start applying that methodology of questioning your objectives, of questioning your activities and questioning your outreach, you'll start realizing that sometimes those really creative, really snazzy looking creators aren't required. It's about understanding the subconscious motivations of audiences, how they view certain words, how they view certain colors, how they view certain lists. You can go on. I'm talking about small nudges. I'm going into depth, but essentially it's an understanding of human behavior. It's an understanding of how people make decisions, how we process information, how we retrieve information, how we substitute questions when we ask them, which leads us into these cognitive biases that can have quite drastic consequences for our lives. And as communicators, if we can understand that psychology behind those decisions and that decision making, we can then create environments where our audiences can thrive.
Yeah, I think you made a really good point there, which doesn't always sort of spring to mind when you're thinking about this. But what, if there's an ask, then people have to understand that there are barriers. So yeah, we need to identify what they are first before we make the ask, because if we're making an ask and there are barriers in place, it's almost like being exclusive, and also it's not giving your campaign or whatever it is you're working on the opportunity to really work, because there's a barrier in place that's saying to somebody, well, you might want to do it, but you can't.
Yeah, 100%. And that's why I think doing a behavioral diagnosis is really important. I would recommend using the COMBI model, which I'm sure a lot of communicators are familiar with, which looks at capability, opportunity, and motivation, and the barriers that exist therein to enable behavior. There's a conception, people seem to think that if you can unlock motivation, behavior will follow. In reality, if you unlock capability and opportunity, motivation follows. So I think the sort of behavioral science is quite wide. It's an interdisciplinary approach, but you can distill it into what we call the choice architecture. Choice architecture is our decision-making environment. So what within our decision-making environment is stopping us from getting to a particular action. And that could be, as a good example, if you want to find a piece of information about, say, the vaccine right now, and you Google it and you can't easily find it, or if you have to click on many links to get to your point of information, or you have to download something, or you have to, there are examples of in the States where you've got to get a small refund, you've got to basically give them an arm and a leg to really access it. So that is, it could be friction, and it could be unintended friction, which is part of policy and process, which communicators should help untangle, or it could be intended friction, which is when it becomes sludge. It becomes, it's the opposite of nudge. So that's choice architecture. And how do we as communicators help navigate that, help our organizations navigate that, ensure the user journey is as friction-free as possible to enhance behaviors. The second piece to consider is our own heuristics and biases. So the mental shortcuts that we take to make our decisions, because a lot of our decisions are automatic. We don't really think about every single decision that we have to make. Do I drink a coffee in the morning? Do I brush my teeth? We don't often go in and make, a list of pros and cons to do that. It's quite automatic. So that's of automatic decision-making, which is the majority of our decision-making, leads to us using mental shortcuts, because we think of our brain as a processor. It can't really take on that so much stress, right? So we've developed these techniques over millennia, which is substituting questions sometimes. As I said before, these shortcuts lead us into predictable errors, and those are the cognitive biases, and that is the entire study of heuristics and biases. So I'm sure our listeners have heard about, the availability bias or status quo bias or this bias, another. There are loads of biases out there, but they all stem from our automatic decision-making, wherein we use mental shortcuts. So communicators, we should understand that process and be able to devise communications that can overcome some of those bias. And then the third element I would also reference is experimentation. So we are not our audience. So unless we test with our audience, unless we actually both qualitatively and quantitatively try to ascertain what resonates with them, we won't be able to know whether our campaign is equipped for success. So in behavioral science terms, we recommend randomized testing. So no bias goes into the process, and we're collecting random data to see if something works or doesn't. The ways of testing it, you test a control versus a variable, and using those data insights then to develop campaigns. So that is, in a nutshell, how you would apply a behavioral science methodology to communications.
How fascinating. And I think, when you're talking about stuff like that, there's a lot of stuff that I think within that people are potentially already doing, but they're not doing it necessarily in the right order, with the right process, with the right hypothesis, and then the testing aspect of it. I'm just thinking just now, so one thing that might interest you is I'm working with John Brown on in a small working group in the PRCA on misinformation and the climate crisis. And we're essentially, like, what we're trying to do is mass global behavior change. And you kind of think, in relation to what we've just been talking about, the why and the how and the who, it needs to be like, I mean, what are your thoughts on like a global campaign to change the world?
I think it's very ambitious, but well done, Laura. I wouldn't expect anything less. I think, I am aware of this piece of work, and it's incredible what you guys are doing with the PRCA, and John's leading it, so that's great. I think with misinformation and disinformation is a really interesting space, and we've just written a blog on Lynn PR on how you can use behavioral science to build trust. Trust is, at the time of writing that blog, was at an all-time low, and the way we communicate online, especially so with being in lockdown, et cetera, means that our levels of mistrust is growing towards institutions. So using behavioral science techniques to build trust, and by that, it's how do you build trust with communities? Well, you co-produce with communities. You use validators, so people within a community who they trust, get them to amplify your message, and you tackle any disinformation/misinformation as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, and as transparently as possible. So those principles could be applied to your campaign to see how you might, it is an ambitious thing, and it would take years before you have any scientific insights into it. But as long as you're co-producing your campaign with a representation across a representative sample of your audience, and you're understanding who your audience trusts to use those individuals and organizations to amplify your message, there's no reason why you can't apply these principles to your campaign.
Yeah, we're doing two pieces of research, one in the industry. If anybody hasn't taken that research, survey it, please do. And one with members of the public, and a lot of that is around trust, like who they trust, why they trust them, etc. And yeah, it is very ambitious, but at the same time,
I love
it. we at the moment, obviously this is a focus on climate crisis, because it's in the lead up to COP in November, which just so happens to be my hometown in Glasgow. But it's very exciting because it's definitely, like, at the time, at the start when we started to talk about it, it was kind of like pushing that boundary a little bit, and then there was a bit of finger wagging at, should the PR industry and communication industry, like, what's their role? And I kind of was like, well, actually, I think it's more, it is our role, because we are, giving strategic advice. So we should be advising on that. And if we're not, then why not? So that's a really interesting conversation that's taking place, and it'll be rolling out across the year. But I think that, your input and your feedback at specific points will be invaluable, actually.
Absolutely, yeah. What an amazing cause, and any change that you can achieve will be such an amazing change. So yeah, absolutely, well done. I'm happy to support in any which way.
See, people, you just have to ask.
That's my philosophy.
You mentioned this earlier on, and I kind of want to go back to it. We often have to work at speed in our industry, for example, maybe in a crisis, or if there's an urgent request from a client or board director or something. You know, I'm just kind of trying to think of examples that you and I briefly talked about before. I've worked in road safety before, and you're working on road safety contracts and stuff just now. I'm just thinking back to behaviour change around roads, around speed, you know, drivers speeding, around specific roads and you know, deaths on the road, and also things like, you know, caravan season when all the caravans were out, and you know, speed limits, and people getting frustrated sitting behind them. You know, we have to work at speed quite a lot, I think, and if I remember correctly, you have got quite a good example of a piece of work you did recently where you basically, I think it was like a 3-week turnaround, and you absolutely nailed it.
Yeah, free your mind. Yes. So this was a mental health campaign we did with our client, Southeast London CCG, and it was delivered in lockdown 1 to support Southeast London residents access resources to improve their, well, to look after their mental health being and improve it if required. So we had 12 weeks between start to finish, and that included research, testing, activation, etc. And it was hugely successful. It was extremely behaviorally informed. We ran, I think, 7 trials, if I remember, to test everything from color to calls to action to creators content. And the results were phenomenal. Mental health is a saturated space, as you can imagine. There's a lot of campaigns that go on in that space. At the time we delivered the campaign, the national Every Mind Matters campaign had also launched. And there was also a lot of other campaigns from charities, rightly so, around mental health. So rising above the noise was a really big ask at the time, and within the period of time we had to deliver. But we took a very data-driven, behaviorally led approach to it. We did our research, we diagnosed the problem, we identified the target behaviors, we recommended interventions and solutions, which we then tested in a randomized way in those control trials, in those RCTs. Which then led us to understanding which particular creative works, which particular content works. And the results were that I am trying to think back, I think we smashed all our KPIs and we generated 4.5 times engagement to average healthcare campaigns. So that was phenomenal. We engaged with 44% of our campaign engagement were from BAME communities, which is obviously a seldom heard group for mental health communications. And the mean BAME population of our patch was 39%. And recently we've got the insights that show that whilst the campaign was going on, there was a spike in referrals to IAPT, which is the psychological therapies, which then dropped as the campaign wrapped up. And then we did a bit of an offshoot campaign for return to schools, and then that picked up a little bit. So we've got that data to correlate that the campaign actually, affected people in picking up the phone or whatever it is in accessing psychological therapies, which is great. We are back for phase 2 right now, and we're specifically looking at psychological therapies in Southeast London and how do we drive up the numbers of referral and access. We've just we completed test phase, I think it was last week, and we went into burst, which is activation. And we'll see how the results do, but we monitor in real time. We can make any adjustments as and when needed, and every single piece of work that we do is data driven. But going back to your point about crisis and behavior change, I think we're seeing with the pandemic that behavioral science can absolutely be applied to communications in a crisis. The entire crisis and the way governments across the world have responded to it has been by using behavioral science, and that is going to be key to our recovery. So yes, it can be used at pace. It's again, going back to methodology, it's a way of thinking. It's not so much something that has to take a lot of time. Yes, it can, but it can also be compressed. And as long as you're using the data correctly and interpreting the data correctly, there's no reason why you can't activate at speed.
If we think about, we quite often talk about the strategic side of what we do and the tactical side of what some people deliver before they even think of the strategic stuff. And I don't think you can operate at pace if you don't have that strategy in place. And it definitely has to come back to, everything has to come back to the business and organisational objectives. and moving at pace obviously requires an understanding and sort of benchmarking. And I think that one huge part of this, and even just you talking about the case study of the mental health campaign, like measurement is a huge part of our work, not least because it's one of the things that we need to actually do at the start and in the middle and at the end. It's not just something that happens at the end. But so how can people use the data from that approach you've just described to tell the measurement story?
Yeah, I think that's so important. And it starts with setting measurable objectives. I judge many awards to know when I see retrofitted evaluation, and that happens a lot. And that's when you haven't set measurable objectives. So you report on vanity metrics like reach, website clicks, engagement, but without context, that narrative is missing. It's hard for people to understand the impact. So it starts with setting SMART objectives at this outset of campaign, ideally connected to business objectives that can deliver outcome. Talking about behavior change, it's important to set behavioral objectives to understand what kind of behaviors you're trying to drive and how you're going to measure them. And from a comms perspective, there'll be campaign measures. Behavior change doesn't happen overnight. So there'll be campaign measures, and there'll also be outcome measures for the behavior, which might be a more long-term piece of analysis. Once you've done that, then I would hope that embracing data, you can monitor some of that data whilst your campaign is rolling to understand whether your objectives were fit for purpose. You know, Barcelona 3.0 principles state that objectives aren't set in stone, that they need to be agile. They need to respond to how your communications and campaigns are performing. And sometimes you will see that your objectives were too low or too high, and that's okay. As long as you're learning and making those adjustments and noting it, that's fine. And then when you get into measurement, then it becomes so much easier when you've got those objectives set, because you're reporting back on what you said you'd achieve. I feel that there is hesitancy within our practice to report on bad news. There's hesitancy to report on bad data, whereas you can learn from any data, good or bad. And again, going back to Barcelona principles, our job is to tell what the data says, not necessarily to put a spin on it so it makes us look good. So if something doesn't work, it is okay to say it didn't work, because that informs your campaign for the future. So it's great when it does, but it's even better in terms of how it positions communications to senior leaders to be able to say, actually, we said we would do this. Turns out that wasn't the right thing. And here's the data that shows you why not. I found when I was in-house that data was powerful to say no. To be able to have the data to hand when someone made a request to say, could you do X, Y, and Z, to have the data to hand to say no. And here's the reason why, and here's the data why we're not going to do it, because either we've done it before, or we know it's not going to work, X, Y, and Z. So data can be a really, really powerful ally to comms.
I just think people are still really scared of term data or the sort of measurement and evaluation piece. I mean, there's a Facebook group that I'm involved in, and there are people that come on regularly talking about, you know, their client expectations and how they said they would achieve 4 pieces of coverage a month, and they've only, you know, and I'm just thinking to myself, like, that is not a representation of what our industry is here to do. It is not a representation of professional work. Don't get me wrong, there is all sorts of shapes and sizes of roles in our industry. I'm not saying that everyone has to do everything, but we can't, and you know, this comes back to the age-old conversation around how do you evaluate public relations. But you know, as you've rightly said as well, you know, even AMEC has changed, you know, the 3.0 Barcelona principles to reflect that your objectives actually are a bit of a movable feast sometimes, depending on where you're starting and where you're going to. And as you've also said, people who don't like to report on the negative side of maybe some of the work that's happened aren't really giving value back to the client or to the organization, because they're keeping that aside so that they don't report on something that they might think is a failure. But actually, as you're saying, it's happened for a reason. You have to look at the good and the bad. You have to have them both in equal measures to be able to understand that. To be able to understand the full picture, absolutely. And I think not only are they now giving back
value to the organizations. And I'm sure it's never a conscious way of doing it. It's just how the practice has evolved, where we report on the good news and the bad. They're also not giving value to their own programs. And there's so much we learn from things that don't work. Primarily, you don't do it again. You don't waste your time doing something that doesn't work. So if you have the data that shows you what works, you scale up the good and you get rid of the bad. And that's why it's important to show both sides of the picture. And from how it's perceived at the top table, if you will, it shows maturity. It shows that communications is a mature discipline, which acknowledges that not everything we push out is going to work. But it has the nuance to be able to say this works, that doesn't. I think it comes back to what I've 4 years been talking about, Laura, is there's a huge capability and confidence issue when it comes to data. People are scared of data because they think of data as big data. And yes, it is big data, but there's so many tools available to distill data for us. It's not so much about reporting on numbers. It's using our communication skills to create a narrative from those numbers. It is actually quite a creative process, if you think about it, where you're looking at piles and piles of data, we're able to extract the most important bits of data that will inform either communications or campaigns or policy, and that takes skill. So it's not, I heard someone say, I'm creative, I'm not a data analyst, nor am I. My math is shocking and I need a calculator for everything. But I can look at a data set and identify trends and patterns and make assessments and hypotheses about what that data is telling me. And it doesn't happen overnight. And you have to look at data over some period of time to get that finesse. But there is so many tools available to help you do that. It goes back to us being subject matter experts for audiences. How do we become subject matter experts of audiences? Well, we need to understand them both from a data perspective and a behavior perspective. So there's an element to upskill in. Why is public relations so widely conflated with media relations? Well, haven't we done that for ourselves? Haven't we created the scenario for us where many years ago it was much easier to report on column inches than to actually be confident and brave and say, you know what, I'm going to actually report on outcomes. So we created this environment where we took the easy route, which is coverage, and we basically educated clients that is public relations, and now we're trying to claw back from it. So if anything, we have ourselves to blame, but we need more people embracing strategic communications and having those conversations to educate clients. It's not their fault if that's how we've created a scenario, but we now need to tell them times have moved on and the way we operate as strategic communicators is very different. And we look at communications objectives that support business objectives. We look at outcomes. We look at how we change behavior. We just need to have that confidence to go out there and stick our names to it.
Yeah, I really take pride and I enjoy telling people how amazing public relations is. And I think there are a number of us in the industry who are so passionate about the industry we work in and truly representing that. And I just love being able to talk about it and to, I suppose, push as well, like push fellow PR practitioners for them to be able to believe it, because I think that we have had such a bad habit of navel gazing and talking in our own bubbles and beating ourselves up, like how do we describe public relations, like what's the actual terminology around it, that type of thing. I mean, just get on and do the work. The work should speak for itself. I think
you're speaking to the converted there.
Yeah, talking about behaviour change, eh?
You get that.
We have had such a great conversation around this, and I'm pretty sure we could probably carry on for hours and hours, especially because we like to gab as well. But listen, thanks so much for all your time today. This International Women's Day episode means a lot because we're talking about, progressing our industry. We're talking about progressing other people's businesses and organizations and industries. We're talking, global climate change. We are, it's important to have these conversations and also to think big as well. I think there's nothing wrong with thinking big.
Nothing at all. No. And it's been such a pleasure being here. I can carry on about Stratcom, state and behavioral science. Literally, I'm not allowed to talk about it at home because my husband gets bored. Any excuse. But yeah, it's been great being here. Hopefully, it's convinced a few people that data isn't that scary and bad numbers isn't that bad.
Yeah.
And I look forward to seeing your campaign on misinformation and anything I can do to help. I'd be more than happy.
Oh, thanks. Well, happy International Women's Day to every awesome woman that's listening, whether you work in business or public relations or you're a completely different field altogether. Know that people like Shay and me are here, and you can, tap us up for contacts or ask us for advice or whatever. It's important, again, that we all stick together. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
That's the latest episode of the People by People podcast, hosted by me, Laura Sutherland. I really enjoyed that one today, and I hope you did too. If you could please leave me a little review on whatever channels you use to listen to your podcast, I'd be super grateful. Also, if you could rate it, and don't forget to subscribe, because when you subscribe, it means that the latest episode goes directly into your app. Thanks again for tuning in, and I will catch up with you very soon.